watching in this lecture, or actually just the next couple slides, is a kid playing with toys. And the toys, or the blocks, are going to be HTML and CSS. And the kit itself is going to be JavaScript. So what does JavaScript do? So we have toys and we have blocks. Basically, JavaScript is going to manipulate those blocks, just like the kid's playing with the toys. He can either modify them, rearrange the HTML elements. He can create HTML elements, delete HTML elements. He can stack them. The rule with JavaScript, or what you can do with JavaScript, is basically anything that you could have originally done with HTML and CSS, you can do after the fact, after the page is loaded with JavaScript. So you can change HTML attributes, you can add new elements, you can delete old elements, you can set CSS code, you can remove CSS code. Everything you could have done beforehand, you can do with JavaScript, basically. And we'll go over some examples of why you actually need JavaScript. Are there any questions about that? Okay. So let's go over some JavaScript examples. Okay. So we've seen on the course website that basically the things that are moving around are caused by JavaScript. So one of the main functionalities of JavaScript is to allow for us to change HTML and CSS styles on elements, and through that we can actually create animations. So these fishes aren't just changing location; they're actually like their location is being changed incrementally to create kind of a smooth transition. But you can do that with JavaScript. Another example is a lot of these slideshow viewers that you're going to see. This animation of going back and forth is done with JavaScript, and the controls with the buttons are also done with JavaScript, so you can cycle back and forth. So that's really animation. You can also, for this one, what we're doing is that we're actually hiding and showing HTML elements. So all this text was hidden previously, and then when we mouse over this box, it actually shows. So you can do things like that. And you can also pull up events. So when you mouse over something, the JavaScript can actually detect that you moused over an element, and it can perform some kind of function, some kind of action. And for this box, what we're doing is, this is actually a div with an image. And when you mouse over it, it basically changes the background image, and it replaces it with the box that's open. So, there's kind of clever ways to make cool-looking effects that are really just quite primitive in terms of how you actually execute them. So it's really just two images, and when you mouse over it, it just replaces the image. So it kind of looks like it's being open on the fly. Some other cool stuff you can do with JavaScript. Fixing like this. This is actually like a big image in the background, and as I move the mouse, it's moving the image basically the opposite way, opposite direction of the mouse. So a lot of this stuff is kind of stuff that you're probably used to seeing in Flash. And basically JavaScript has really come a long way in terms of what you can do. Most of the projects that I do and Amber does and John does now just use JavaScript, and we avoid Flash altogether just because you can do so many interesting things already. I think the only limitation of JavaScript really is something like streaming movies, or something that's more media intensive, like maybe streaming video, or sorry, streaming audio. But with HTML5, you're going to be able to do streaming video also with just HTML. So it's just a smart move to get into JavaScript. And of course, because it's JavaScript, it's actually understood by most devices with the browser. So everything here will run in your phone. It doesn't really have to have Flash installed. And I'm sure you guys all have heard too, the new Apple devices don't support Flash. So, okay, so let's go back to the lecture. So you can do animations, you can kind of move objects around, you can change background images, so you can set CSS styles on the fly. Oh, there's another one. And I'm using this because I don't have any other examples of this, but you can do like modal pop-ups. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm sure you guys have seen it on some other sites. So you can do kind of pop-ups. So the page is loaded right now, and if I actually click this button, it will go and create this pop-up. So this is being created with JavaScript. JavaScript is actually creating all these little elements and then putting it on top of the elements that are already on the page. And you can also do things like filtering and removing things.
What's meant by a modal pop-up?
A modal pop-up, I'm not sure why the terminology is that way, but it's basically just a pop-up that comes up on the screen later. I don't know, does anyone know why it's called modal pop-up? I think modal has to do with one action or something. I don't know. It's just a pop-up basically.
Okay.
So any kind of manipulation with the page, like sorting or whatever, can be done with JavaScript also. So how do you spot JavaScript, or how do you know something is using JavaScript? Basically, if the page is moving after it's been loaded, it's using JavaScript. If it's not using something like Flash. The exceptions to that that we've seen are just hover, active, and visited. So when you're actually using CSS, you can kind of specify like a different state or a different style to apply when you're mousing over certain elements, and you can do that with just CSS. But besides that, if you see something kind of moving around on the screen, it's either JavaScript or Flash, and if it's not Flash, then it's JavaScript. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how JavaScript actually does what it does. How does it kind of move things around? So when you initially load an HTML file, and here's kind of a mock example of an HTML file. When the browser loads this, it's going to create what's called a DOM tree. And the DOM tree is just a representation of the file that's loaded. So it parses through this, and then it creates internally its own representation of that file. So here's basically the counterpart of that file over there. You have the HTML element at the top. It's the element that's nesting everything, so it's the outermost element, and then nested within it, its children are going to be the elements that are nested within it. So this is also not something that's too important. This is just kind of background on how JavaScript works and how it runs and how your browser interprets HTML files. So like I said, the browser is going to go ahead and parse the HTML file, and for each element that it basically reads, it's going to create a new entry in its DOM tree. And for each attribute that's also set on that element, like the source attribute, for instance, it's going to be created in the DOM tree also. So what happens actually is, once the browser has constructed that DOM tree, it's going to display whatever that tree says. And it's not going to display exactly what it says just when the page is loaded, but it's going to display what that tree says at any instant. So knowing that, can anyone give a hypothesis on how JavaScript actually modifies a page that's already been loaded? Yeah, it changed the DOM tree, right? So basically, your browser displays anything that DOM tree says, and at any instant. So if you go ahead and you have JavaScript, and JavaScript goes in and modifies that DOM tree, then it's actually going to change what's going to show up in your browser window also. So that's basically the background for JavaScript. We're going to go ahead and talk about jQuery now. And jQuery is actually a library that's built on top of your traditional JavaScript. So in this course, we're not going to teach just basic JavaScript. We're going to teach something called jQuery, which is built on top of JavaScript. And you can basically do all the same functionality that you could in normal JavaScript. But jQuery has a couple benefits over just writing vanilla JavaScript. And the main reason, or the main benefit of it, is that it simplifies a lot of the work. So if you wrote something in JavaScript and you wrote it again in jQuery, you'd see just the size and complexity of what it is that you're writing just shrink enormously. So there's a lot of efficiency to be gained with the jQuery library. Also, we kind of talked about this a little bit also before. Different browsers render different web pages different ways. With HTML and CSS, they also behave differently depending on the JavaScript version that they're running. So Internet Explorer has a different way of doing Ajax, and we'll talk about Ajax later. Has a different way of doing JavaScript for certain things than Mozilla or Firefox. So if you were to write out just standard JavaScript, you'd have to take all of that into account. But if you use something like jQuery, the writers of jQuery have already taken all that into account for you. And so what you can do is you can actually just write your code in terms of jQuery, and you can be sure that it's going to work across different browsers up to a certain point. And jQuery allows us to do these 4 things pretty simply. It lets us traverse the DOM tree, so select different elements in the DOM tree, change where we are in the DOM tree, and it lets us take care of events pretty easily. So you can do click events, hover events, key down events, and this will make a little more sense later when we get into it. And it allows us to do animations and a whole host of other things that you can do with JavaScript. You can do just much simpler in jQuery. And jQuery is it's pretty well adopted. It's used by Google and Yahoo. There's other frameworks that come up all the time. And when you're doing like web dev, new languages and new trends come up all the time. But jQuery has been around for a long time. It's pretty well accepted. I use it all the time. Also, it's really great. Okay. So I pitched you guys on jQuery. How do you guys actually use jQuery? What you have to do is just go to the jQuery website and you can download the latest file. And once you have that latest file, you want to just include it in your HTML file. And you want to make sure when you're doing jQuery and writing things on top of jQuery that jQuery is just the first file that you actually include. So you want to put it on top of your own JS file. And that's just so if you wrote your own code and it's based on jQuery, if it's on top of this line, it'll try and execute the framework that hasn't actually been loaded yet. So you want to make sure this order is correct. And another thing with jQuery is in your actual JavaScript code, when you are going to do something in jQuery, you want to put all your code inside these 2 tags. And what that basically means is it only executes the code that you've written once that page is entirely loaded. So if you didn't do this, what might happen is some elements might be interpreted by the browser but not fully rendered yet, and then the browser will execute the JavaScript, and the JavaScript won't find the element that you're referring to. So you just have to put just basically all your jQuery inside these 2 lines, and then you'll make sure that the code is only executed once the page is fully loaded, and you'll avoid a whole bunch of headaches and problems just from doing that. So just remember to always put it inside the .ready method. Are there any questions? So the basic coding flow of jQuery, and it's quite different than normal programming if you have that programming background. The way that you do jQuery is you select basically the element that you want to perform some action on, and then you chain different method calls, different actions on that element. So the selecting, or the way that you actually select the element with jQuery, is you just use your CSS selectors. So you're going to use this special syntax with the $, the 2 parens, and the quotes. You want to make sure you have the quotes. And then you're just going to type in your CSS selector string. So everything that you've learned previously with CSS, how to select different elements, you can just apply to JavaScript. And this is by far a much easier way to select elements than if you were to use just standard JavaScript. So once you've selected the element that you want, you can just basically call different actions on that element that you selected. And jQuery has a couple of different methods already built in. Like .css, you can actually use to change CSS, CSS properties, and a whole host of other things. So a lot of it is pre-built for you. And I'll show you guys really quickly just an example of kind of what you can do with JavaScript and jQuery. So here's a line of code, and I'll go over it before I actually show you the demo. What it's doing is it's selecting an element. What kind of element is it selecting, or which element is it selecting? Can you guys tell from this?
Class button.
Yeah, so the element with class button. Okay, and then it's saying when you click it, it's going to execute this function that we've written. And what it's going to do is just find a H1 element, or all the H1 elements, if there are multiple ones, and set their color to red. Does everyone kind of see that? It's a little bit trickier to write, but kind of once you've written it, it's pretty neat and it's pretty understandable by anyone that hasn't really even had a programming experience.
What does the return false do?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. So we have return false here, and actually in your code you're going to want to use this return false quite a bit also. I think jQuery has something that says like disable default action, but what it does is when you do return false inside an event like .click, it says only